So do you remember way back in the last fantasy news how I started it like this? Do you remember last week when I put out an additional fantasy news to try and cut off having to cover any big industry drama here? Turns out the gods saw that and decided, not only was I completely wrong in assuming that this controversy was going to be entering its twilight era, but in fact, the Hugo Awards controversy has hit the NOS button and escalated into a whole other level of scandal. Now, before we get into it, I want to actually say, for the first time ever in fantasy news, we're going to be fully recapping what we know to have happened. And I'm going to be doing this because I think it's really important to simply state the existing scandal so you can then see how it affects the escalated one. Also, it has just been spanning over weeks, and I know many of you have your own lives and are not thinking about this as much as I do. And so for that reason, I would like to bestow the Hugo Awards with the first ever fantasy news Such a Big Scandal It Needs a Recap award. Yay! And I want to give a tremendous shout out to the main write-up I'm going to be pulling from for this, and that is written by Abigail Nussbaum. Not only does she recap the scandal as it existed, but then goes really eloquently in depth about the full extent of holy shittery that the Hugos have allegedly been up to. Let's go ahead and jump on into it. So for those of you who are unaware, the first inklings to mass audiences that something could have been a bit iffy with the Hugo Awards was the severe delay in releasing the final statistics, something the Hugo Awards typically is quite punctual on. Who got how many votes, where the final nominees were positioned, it's a cool bit of transparency. The problem is when the 2023 Hugo statistics were announced, there were several authors with asterisks by their name just saying they were disqualified for essentially no reason. Making it even stranger, these disqualifications were next to other works that were disqualified for valid reasons. So we knew there was something a bit fishy going on, especially because the authors included queer authors and those that have been critical of China. Abigail sums this up beautifully when she says, in 2023, Hugo administrator Dave McCarty, remember that just lovely fella, added another criteria to the validation process, that of compliance with Chinese political and social agendas. The emails leaked by team member Diane Lacey shows the validation team compiling dossiers on both nominated works and their authors, debating whether a novel like R.F. Kuang's Babel, whose protagonist is a Chinese man raised in England and which visits China during the time of the First Opium War, would be offensive to PRC sensibilities, and whether Paul Weimer, who should have been nominated in the Best Fan Writer category, should be disqualified because of a visit to Tibet. I want to really re-emphasize that. From what we've seen, they were not asked to do this. These are people involved with the Hugo Awards on their own volition, as far as we can tell, writing up without being asked dossiers on whether or not these authors would upset Chinese sensibilities. Now, there is some speculation that there could have been some other motivation there, but we'll get into that. And remember, this is the smaller part of the scandal.
Hold on to your butts.
These confirmed the theories people had around why authors like Jiren J. Zhao and Rebecca Kuang were disqualified. It was purely for political reasons. And as Abigail points out, there were some people who were speculating that people like Dave McCarty were trying to protect people from the CC. No, this is them, as you can see in these emails, just wanting to have, I guess, a scandal-free Hugo? Mission accomplished. And my favorite part of what Abigail points out here is that Babel is getting a Chinese translation and is going to be released over there. Correction, it's not forthcoming, it's already out. And it seems they didn't even do this competently because while they disqualified Babel, which is getting a Chinese translation and release, they didn't disqualify Nettle and Bone, which isn't and was written by an author who has visited Tibet. Now, it has been seen that Chinese commentators from websites like File 770 have suggested that the pressure to censor nominees came not from the government, but from business interests who appear to have taken over the running of the Chengdu Worldcon from the fans who originally organized the bid. That is entirely speculation, though, and that's very important to keep in mind. But here is where the real scandal that has come to light comes into play. Because as we previously covered, there was someone who leaked these emails. And once the fans have begun to pick through the more detailed data, there have been some sweeping and severe disqualifications that previously flew under the radar. And I want to get this exactly right, so please excuse as I pull directly from the article. Again, Abigail, incredible write-up. The raw data spreadsheet Lisi leaked does not merely show the nominees like Babel and Paul Weimer were discarded for supposedly running afoul of PRC ideology. It also shows a large number of nominees, mostly Chinese language, which do not appear anywhere on the final ballot or the nomination stats. When questioned about these nominations in the comments of File 77, Lacey, who again has been apologetic about her treatment of Western nominees, replied simply that these nominations had been considered slate nominations. It's the removal of these nominations, Lacey suggests, that has caused the cliff that many commentators observe in the final Hugo stats, in which there was a drop of hundreds of nominating ballots between the top 5 to 6 vote getters and the ones below them. I'm going to say this again because it is so shocking that it seems to have taken a lot of people some time to grasp the enormity of it. Hundreds, perhaps even thousands of valid, legal nominating ballots were dropped from the final nominating stats, apparently under the pretext of having represented a slate, even though slates are perfectly legal under the Hugo rules. This was done on the orders of the Hugo administrator, with apparently no outside input or discussion, and appears to have elicited so little response from the Hugo team that they are casually mentioning it as if it is nothing. If these numbers are correct, it is entirely possible that the whole Hugo ballot should have looked completely different, and that none of the eventual winners in the fiction categories should have even been nominated. And at this point, I might be an idiot, so this could just be my brain. I started thinking, like, was the original scandal some kind of smokescreen to then hide what was actually happening to disenfranchise Chinese-based nominations? But the more I think about it, the more it seems to be a mixture of blistering incompetence, stupidity, and racism. If you're confused about what exactly slates are, as Kitty was here in her response, Abigail actually answers this question in the comments section below, where she says, the focus on slates stems from the slad puppy / rabid puppy debacle of 2014-2016, in which a group of right-wing writers tried to brigade the award in response to a supposed takeover by women and people of color. They compiled recommendation lists and got large numbers of supporters to vote for them down the line, which overwhelmed the more dispersed votes of the regular Worldcon members. The problem with this situation is that compiling a recommendation list and voting is not against Hugo rules, and discarding hundreds of identical or nearly identical ballots is not supposed to be permissible. Many changes that have been made to the coalition of Hugo nominating votes and measures taken to raise awareness of eligible work were intended to dilute the effect of slate voting. Removing votes en masse has never been considered as a viable response, but it seems to have been undertaken last year. Now, if you're like me, you're probably thinking these two scandals are quite contradictory, and why, oh why, would there be some kind of effort to rig the ballots to favor non-Chinese finalists? And we don't have detailed exact answers yet, though there does seem to be a common factor of Dave with additional allegations of harassment that are detailed in this report. And it just comes down at the end of all of it, for at least how it's going to impact us who can't really change anything, of the concept of integrity and how long and hard Hugo's worked to maintain it and how quickly it can be just flushed away. It's put quite well just how strange this all is in this next passage. Appalling as it is, the choice to screen English language nominees for ideological compatibility may in fact be a sideshow to the real scandal, which is that hundreds of Chinese voters have been disenfranchised. And, barring even more revelations, this disenfranchisement cannot be blamed on PRC sensibilities and censorship.
What are you doing, Dave?
The decision came from the American and Canadian staffers who made up the English language Hugo team, many of them Worldcon volunteers of long standing. If the allegations that are now emerging claiming that McCarty has behaved this way in the past and also harassed other Worldcon staffers are to be believed, it's a profound failure on the part of Worldcon and its members to police toxic members, which has now blown up in all our faces. And it's a problem that casts all past Hugo Awards in doubt. not existential doubt, because one of the advantages of EPH is that it reveals fiddling with the nominating ballots quite effectively. And the irregularities seen in the Chengdu nominating stats do not appear in previous year's data, but nonetheless, it's impossible to pretend that the award's reputation can ever be what it was. And that I agree with. Again, I have to cover my butt here because we've seen recently here in fantasy news that stories can pivot, new information that can come out. We're even seeing that here in this Hugo controversy. But this is titanic. And also, what? Weird. I agree with Abigail here when she observes that the fire is inside the house. This problem seems to be fundamentally built into how the Hugo Awards are being run right now. Because yes, they like to say how it's passed from country to country, but there is still a core group of people involved. And these practices are abhorrent. And it makes complete sense why we're seeing names like Adrian Tchaikovsky absolutely say, no thank you, I do not want to be associated with this. And he's taking just as badass a stand as Samantha Mills did in the last episode of Fantasy News. But I want to end this by saying, shout out to the Glasgow team to an extent. They have committed to releasing their 2024 stats immediately as the 2024 award ends and revealing an exact name and reason why any work is struck down as ineligible. I'm not going to sit here and pretend like I know some kind of solution to this because outside of the plethora of administrative and procedural issues we've seen highlighted here, in terms of a reputation crisis, to me, this seems terminal because there are so many people who in the real world weren't even really aware of what the Hugo Awards were. But suddenly this is grabbing major headlines on gargantuan news outlets. And this is many people's first exposure to what the Hugo Awards are. Don't be wrong, I know the Hugo Awards are a big deal and they've been around for a long, long time, but go ask your neighbor what the Hugo Awards are. Nerd shit. Controversy like this spreads like wildfire on the internet. Hey, it's why I've made so many videos dedicated to it here. I genuinely do care. It's a part of my passion. But yeah, I also know this will do well. And what comes next for the Hugos? This goes from a debacle that they will need many years to recover from to this could be terminal. That is just my coverage of this escalation from the Hugo Awards. I don't have a whole lot more to add here aside from just saying, hey, if you're unaware, I have a second channel that I just created called Sheveled Goblin, where I will be hosting my author interviews. I have one dropping on Monday with Christopher Rocchio, where we're gonna be talking about Sun Eater, the development of great science fiction concepts and characters. Definitely check that on out. I've had 2 videos drop this week that have not performed great, one of which is because I'm pretty sure I accidentally got it repressed by putting a joke title on it. So if you'd like to see my review of Fire and Song, it's there. And if you'd like to see a first and last about a Robert Jordan book, it's right there. Give you a little bit of fun time to recover from this. Wow. But like and subscribe if you have not already. Hit the Patreon if you want to support what I do here. And have a better one than Hugo, y'all. Peace.